Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the East India Company. The East India Company was a corporation that was run out of a modest building in London. It existed between 1599 and 1857, a 250-year plus span in which the corporation would help lead to Great Britain becoming a colonial power in the eastern portion of the world and also launch an epoch of corporate power. My guest for this conversation is William Dalrymple. William Dalrymple is a historian and a writer, and he's the author of the book The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. He joins me over Zoom. William Dalrymple, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Very good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir. East India Company is born in 1599. Is this the birth of the modern-day corporation?
Not quite, almost. There are a few joint stock corporations that precede this. The first is about 60 years earlier, 1524. The Muscovy Company is formed in London to trade with Moscow. And this was a sort of fur trading. They dealt in sable and goods like that. And there are a couple of other small corporations formed. But the East India Company is really the first big multinational corporation in that it's one that begins to straddle the globe. And out of this office in London, are controlled not just colonial interests in India, across as far as Hong Kong, but the tea gathered in Hong Kong is, of course, then sold in America, which is where the Boston Tea Party comes in. It's East India Company tea that's dumped at the beginning of the American Revolution. So this is partly an American story.
And they knew about the East India Company. It had a reputation by 1776.
They were deeply frightened of it. The East India Company had just been exposed. There'd been a whole lot of whistleblowing going on immediately before the revolution. And the fact that 1/3 of the population of Bengal had starved to death under company violence and failure to govern was something that had broken in London in sort of 1772, 1773. So in the immediate period before the Boston Tea Party. And there was an awful lot of stuff coming through to Massachusetts in the form of periodicals like The Spectator and the Gentleman's Magazine, which were being avidly read on the East Coast of America. And there's an awful lot of writing which doesn't make it often into the modern historical version of why the revolution took place. But there was clear fear in the Americas that the East India Company, having finished with Bengal and India, would be let loose in all its power and corruption on the Americas. And the book contains some detailed tracts written in the run-up to the Boston Tea Party, when people are really genuinely afraid that the East India Company is going to be allowed to run a sort of corporate tyranny in the Americas. And it's a very, very interesting part of the whole story. I think we should perhaps explain, before we say anything else, about what a joint stock corporation means at this time. You're coming out of a period when business is largely controlled by guilds. So you have wool guilds and guilds that deal in leather goods or haberdashers or so on. And these are professional bodies of people that work inside a particular trade. So all the wool merchants will gather their goods and their trade, and they might sort of pool it to go and sell it in Brussels or do some joint corporate activity. Where a joint stock corporation is different is that outside investors who've got nothing to do with the executive running of the company can put in their money in return for a share of the profits. And this means that these new joint stock corporations can have capital bases which are infinitely larger than anything that existed in the Middle Ages. So if you were a merchant's guild in Suffolk, you might actually be quite wealthy enough to build some gorgeous guild halls which still survive in various provincial towns in East Anglia and so on. But the new corporations were, cutting-edge financial instruments that allowed people to gather often quite small donations from small-time shopkeepers and so on, putting in £5 and £10 up to the Lord Mayor of London investing £2,000 or £3,000. And together they were able to buy ships, supplies, and crucially weapons, because this was an armed trade. And from the beginning, the East India Company had armed guards and cannons on its ships. And what we see in due course, and this is in a sense the point of the book, is that those private security guards transform into initially a small but very effective military force, but ultimately the largest army in Asia. And in 1800, just as Britain is rearming to take on Napoleon, the British army has 100,000 men under the crown, but the East India Company army in India has 200,000 men the same year. It is literally the double the size of the British army. So the equivalent today would be Tesla with nuclear weapons, or Facebook with rockets, or I don't know, Microsoft with submarines. And this is what made it such a terrifying instrument, because while it starts off as a recognizable beast, a trading company that gathers money in one place, sails over to the other side of the road, buys goods, and then sails back and sells them for profit. Quite soon into its history, the East India Company is actually conquering chunks of territory. What you find in India is that the East India Company, by 1800, has conquered the entire subcontinent south of the Himalayas. This is not just some peripheral exotic land, sort of, somewhere in the east. In the 18th century, the East India Company in the 18th century, the Mughal Empire is the richest power in the globe, producing about a quarter of world GDP. Today, when we think of the Mughals, if people think of them at all, we think of the Taj Mahal and beautiful women and dancing girls in gilt palaces and so on. But, as with all great empires, all that money comes from somewhere. And in this case, it comes from particularly the textile trade. The Mughals had a spectacular textile tradition. And they make beautiful silks and beautiful embroideries and gorgeous cloth. But they also make the best cloth in the world very, very cheaply, simple white cotton cloth, which they export all over the globe. And they don't have their own navy. They use the East India Company's navy to do so. So by the mid or nearly the 18th century, you have deindustrialization in Mexico because of the sheer quantity of cheap Indian cloth being imported from Mughal India by the East India Company.
You write this in your book, The Anarchy, quote, "We still talk about the British conquering India, but that phrase disguises a more sinister reality. It was not the British government that began seizing great chunks of India in the mid-18th century, but a dangerously unregulated private company headquartered in one small office, 5 windows wide, in London." This is interesting to me because, as you write there, we do think of Great Britain's colonization of India as being from the state itself, and that would eventually happen after the East India Company is then nationalized in 1857 or around there, and then
that's a complicated story, because it starts off as this completely libertarian free market organization without any government control at all. All it has is a government charter, which it pays for, and then off it goes and does more or less what it wants. It also has the right to issue its own passport, so you can't actually get to India legally without coming in an East India Company vessel or getting an East India Company passport. So there's no kind of investigative reporting going on in the kind of Tudor press or something with what these people are getting up to and the misbehavior and the looting and the pillage that's going on. And it's only when things get really bad that whistleblowers within the company start exposing what's going on and the massive scale of the looting and asset stripping. Looting, incidentally, is of course an Indian word. Lutna means to plunder, and it enters the English language at this time to describe the activities of the East India Company, which does what any company would do. It exists. The DNA of a company is to make maximum profits for its shareholders and its directors. And often that's done by asset stripping areas that you've bought or conquered. And the East India Company just takes over state by state what had been the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire, this vast and incredibly sophisticated empire running from Bengal to Gujarat, from Afghanistan, from Kabul as the northern capital, right down to southern India. This great chunk of the world is ruled by the Mughals. And at that time, the company can do business, but it can't possibly dream of conquering anywhere. But when the Mughal Empire breaks up in the mid-18th century and gives way to civil war, that's the moment that the company suddenly realizes that it can pick off these small successor states, state by state. And they introduce, this is the crucial thing, they introduce amazing new European military technology that's just been proved on the battlefields of Flanders by Frederick the Great of Prussia. And Frederick the Great, particularly in the War of the Austrian Succession, has a whole lot of new military techniques. File firing by muskets, that's when all those guys line up, kneel down, fire at once, and then the guys who've been loading behind them replace them, kneel down, and they fire. And this, in the 18th century, is extraordinary new firepower, plus horse artillery, plus 18th century developments in ballistics. And this stuff can blow a hole in any Mughal cavalry army. And so the company can pick off these small provincial armies that replace the Mughal Empire, one by one, using technology that has never been seen before in India. They realize very quickly that in this disunity and in this chaos, this anarchy which follows the breakup of the Mughal Empire, that they can borrow money from Indian moneylenders. They don't even have to import the money from Europe. They can just do a deal, financier to financier, with the local bankers. And the local bankers love the company because, it may loot, pillage, and do all sorts of terrible things, but it knows about commercial contracts, it repays its debts on time with interest, and it knows how to do business. So what you find is that a very, very small number of troops, of white troops, officer a very large number of Indian sepoys, paid for by Indian bankers and controlled from London by, again, an office that is, as late as the mid-18th century, often has as little as 35 people in it. So it's an extraordinary thing, the skeleton staff that pull off one of the great corporate acts of violence in world history, which is the looting, pillage, conquest, and asset stripping of Mughal India.
It is interesting because the Mughal Empire, which is an Islamic empire, as you mentioned, is the richest empire of all the world. Europeans, and specifically the English, are not necessarily seen as an advanced people. In fact, are seen quite the opposite, as people that are behind the times. And yet here they come and they still conquer what was the most powerful empire in the world at the time. It's
extraordinary, the difference. I mean, when the company is founded in 1800, the Mughal Empire is at its peak. It has 1 million soldiers under arms, and it's producing a quarter of the world's GDP. Britain at the same stage is producing, or England at least, because Britain hasn't even been formed yet, just England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales as separate countries. But England is producing about 7% of the world's GDP at the time the Mughals are producing 40%. And then the other big producer, of course, is Ming China. So Ming China and Mughal India, these two massive Asian powers, while the Europeans are just, are child play in comparison to this. But by the mid-18th century, the tables are turning. The Europeans have got joint stock corporations, advanced banking facilities. They can raise capital very quickly. They've made extraordinary military advances, so can deploy file-firing muskets, horse artillery, ballistics, all this sort of stuff against the Mughals. And meanwhile, the Mughal Empire is broken up. So rather than facing one enormous adversary, they're facing a whole tiny succession of city-states. And they go through it like a knife through butter. And the first big conquests, there's some provisional skirmishes in the 1740s, often with the English East India Company shadowing the activities of the French East India Company, the Compagnie des Indes. And these two are messing around in the 1740s together. But by the 1750s, the English East India Company has taken a clear lead, and it seized Bengal, which is the single richest province. And the man in charge of this is this incredible, he's the villain, really, of my book. He's the Lord Voldemort of this tale, and he's called Robert Clive. And this is a man who generations of Englishmen have been taught to look up to as a national hero. His statue still stands at the back of Downing Street. But he is an incredibly ruthless operator. Initially hired by Indian bankers to get rid of a Nawab they didn't like. He then just runs with it, and having seen how effective European military technology is against these armies, he just carries on going. And within another 10 years, he's conquered the whole of the Gangetic Plain and brought the Mughal Emperor, and two provincial governors in Bengal and Lucknow to their knees. And then you have this sort of corporate asset stripping. It's like in the 1980s when one of those big corporations would swoop in on some small innocent business and just take away all its assets and sell it for profit. That's what happens, but on a vast continental scale in mid-18th century India. And Clive is this brilliant, ruthless, completely cold-blooded character who realizes that he can do more or less what he likes. When he walks into the treasury of the Nawab of Bengal, having defeated him in battle, he just fills his pockets with jewels that are lying around in great heaps. And when he's later brought before Parliament and asked, who gave him permission to do this, well, how on earth did he think he could do this? He just replied, "My lords, I was astonished. I stand astonished at my own moderation." So you get the kind of character.
You wrote an opinion piece calling for the taking down of that Robert Clive statue at Downey Hall.
Absolutely right. And because, according to our contemporary lights, this man, far from being an imperial hero, A, he wasn't really representing the British government at all. He was representing a commercial company. And B, he was indirectly responsible for about 3 million people starving to death. During the Great Bengal Famine, which took place immediately after he'd left India, but as a result of many of the policies that he put into order, 3 million people are killed, and the East India Company, in order to gather the taxes that it needs to operate, despite these people starving to death, sends its soldiers out into the countryside to gather taxes. Anyone that can't pay is hung. And there's no question of starting soup kitchens or feeding the poor or anything. These guys are left in enormous, emaciated mountains, dying in the streets. There are, Indian powers nearby do set up soup kitchens. In Lucknow, where there's a local Nawab, he builds an enormous building that's still there called the Ashrafkhana near the Rumeli Gate, and he employs, I don't know, many hundreds of thousands of people on a pittance a day and arranges soup kitchens to feed them all, just to keep them all alive. But the company, because it's a company, doesn't see it as its job to look after starving people. And these people just die when very easy, a few shipments of grain up and down the rivers would have very easily sorted it out. And this is the crucial point, when the annual general meeting takes place the next year, and the shareholders of the East India Company are told what's happened, there's been a famine, but we gathered the full tax nonetheless, they vote themselves an increase in the dividend from 10 to 12.5% over the bodies of about 3 to 6 million dead Bengalis. So this is
1777 when the famine.
This is 1772.
1772
when this happened. Yeah. And what happens next is very interesting, and again something that has many contemporary echoes. And that is that the company, 1 year on, the cupboard is completely bare. They've successfully pulled every last rupee out of every hiding place the year before, but there is nothing more, and everyone's starving, and so no one's working. So the following year, they don't get any tax receipts in at all, and the share price of the company collapses. It's a bit like the subprime situation a decade ago, and what you then get is the company being partly taken over by the government. 50% of the shares are bought by the government. So it's a bit like, unlike Lehman Brothers, the East India Company is too big to fail. And it becomes this partly nationalized, partly free market, private, what would you call it? It's a public-private partnership, I suppose, something like that.
Too big to fail because so much of the economy now is based on what the East India Company is doing.
By this stage, the East India Company is the biggest employer in Britain. It employs, sail makers and shipbuilders, as well as clerks and warehouse men and what have you, as well as all the soldiers and administrators sent out to India. And it controls about half the imports into Britain. So it's a massive chunk of the economy. It's bigger than Tesla, Google, and Microsoft combined. And what's fascinating is that just like today, what I love about the story, just to go back, I suppose, one step, what I love about the story is that it combines two of the great stories, really, of our times. One is the whole story of colonialism and its aftermath, the story of how all these European empires went out, conquered chunks of the globe, looted them, and brought the wealth back home, and the legacy that's left across the world, from which, in a sense, we're just recovering. But secondly, it's also the story of big corporations. And that is a very contemporary story. We are anxious about the way that Google harvests our data, the way that it reads our emails. Probably tomorrow you're going to start getting adverts on your Facebook feed for East India Company teas or good curries or something after we've had this conversation. And this is a big, this is not an entirely baseless worry for many people today, that their data, their mails and everything are being read. And you can argue, sure, the East India Company had 200,000 soldiers and ships and cannon and what have you. But Tesla and Microsoft and Google don't need that. They already have annual turnovers that are bigger than the GDPs of most nations in the world. Without ever needing to have an army, they just spy on us all and harvest our data. So it's a very, what I have loved about the story, I've been writing on the East India Company for 20 years now. I've written 4 books, of which we've talked about some before on your show. But this Anarchy, in a sense, is the summation of the whole thing, because this is the story of how one multinational corporation, almost the first multinational corporation in history, grows to be this leviathan, engulfing world trade and controlling about half the world economy at its peak.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the history of the East India Company. Our guest for this conversation is William Dalrymple. He is the author of the book, The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. Would you say this is also the beginning of powerful corporate lobby in government?
Well, very good point. So what you get at this stage is a lot of the things we worry most about with corporations. First of all, of course, is corporate corruption. 90 years into the history of this company, the governor is arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Why? Because he's been caught bribing parliamentarians with money to extend the company's monopoly. In the first case of its kind in world history, a corporation has given money to MPs, to the legislature, in order to achieve an economic goal of its own. And after that, there are more subtle ways of control. Many East India Company men who've made their fortunes in India and shipped them home to Britain then become MPs on their retirement from the company, and the company has its own body of MPs who are its own personnel, each with their own rotten borough by the mid 18th century or end of the 18th century. And beyond that, half the MPs in Parliament have got East India Company shares, and so are not going to vote to damage their own financial well-being. And so you set up, for the first time in history, something that's very familiar to us today: the power of the state against the power of the corporation. In this case, the state wins. In 1858, having gradually seized more and more of the company is rolled up and replaced by the British Raj. But who knows, in our own time, as I say, there is a rich history. You could write another whole book about the story of corporations that have brought down states. Think, for example, 1956, Mossadegh in Iran.
This is the Anglo-Persian company.
Yeah, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company brings about a coup with the aid of the CIA and MI6, because they think that the Persians are going to nationalize Anglo-Persian oil. 2 years later, similar thing in Guatemala, United Fruit, which worries that a socialist government in Guatemala is going to seize all its land with nationalization, brings about a coup and a right-wing government is installed by the CIA, and the term Banana Republic is born. 1977, ITT and Salvador Allende is thrown out in Chile, and a right-wing government pro-business is replaced. So there is this long history of this, in a sense, this secret war between the power of the state and the power of the corporation. But the East India Company is the first time these battle lines are formed. And not only does the East India Company bring down government after government in India, it also does its best to exert its influence and undermine the power of Parliament in England. In the end, Parliament wins in this case. But in the longer term, who knows whether corporations like Tesla and Google and Facebook and so on are going to become more powerful than the government of the United States. They're certainly already more powerful than many third world countries. And so you find you find that in weaker states already corporations exert often a very baleful influence on the health of the state.
Well, was there a power struggle between the state and the company when
very much so,
the state nationalized?
And you get these occasions when the power, the company uses its muscle to get various votes through Parliament, to get the state to support it, because for example, during various wars, the company needs the power of the Royal Navy and so on to support it. But often when those wars are over, the company will hang on to its winnings without giving them to the state to run. It'll be part of its empire rather than the state's. And it's only in 1858 that all these East India Company possessions are handed over to the administration of the Foreign Office and the Commonwealth Department.
Again, I just want to really underline this point. We all know about the long history of British colonialism in India, but it seems something like, my math may be off, but it seems something like 2/3 of that period of time it was done by a private corporation.
Your maths is dead on, Mitch. You've got it exactly right. 250 years, 1600 to 1858, is corporate rule, and 90 years only is the famous Raj. Whenever we think of the British in India, we think of all those movies of Gandhi or The Jewel in the Crown, or Passage to India with all those guys in solar topis and women in crinoline dresses waltzing over Bangalore club lawns and croquet with Maharajas and elephants. All that stuff is actually only 90 years. And before that, it's the corporate rule of the East India Company for 250 years. Very painful. But I mean, for the British, it's a wonderful thing, because Britain, in the Elizabethan period is rising, but it's still really peripheral to the main action in Europe. Italy and France are very rich, but the big new money spinners are Spain and Portugal, bringing in the gold from the New World. England is on the edge of all that. But by 1900, with two sources of income, first of all, the looting of India, but secondly, the Caribbean slave trade, England has vaulted over its continental rivals and is now the leading economic power throughout the 19th century in the world. And that's what provides the seed fund for the Industrial Revolution, which further enriches Britain. But the kickoff, the money that starts the whole thing, is this looting of India, and millions of pounds a year are sent back from India. Some of it, legitimate trade. There's an awful lot of trade in textiles and spices, and then there follows this period when the East India Company turns into the largest narco operator in history. We think of the Medellin cartel. The East India Company was a far larger and far more sophisticated drug runner. They grow
opium wars with China.
Exactly that. They grow opium in Bengal, which after they've conquered it, they sell it illegally in China, and with the money that they get in China, they buy tea, which they sell in India, Europe, and as we said, in Boston and the rest of America.
And the war was a free market war. In other words, China was saying no more opium here, and the East India companies was forcing, or maybe it was Great Britain at the time. My timeline's
Great
off.
Britain by that stage,
Yeah.
1842, that they are waving the flag of free trade, despite the fact that the trade they're trying to force on the Chinese is narcotics, is opium. It's it's the equivalent of the Medellin cartel trying to feed Florida with coke. And it's very much that story. And the East India Company makes a bomb. It is the largest narco operator in history. Pablo Escobar could have learned many lessons from the East India Company.
It's interesting to think about colonialism beginning with a corporation, but even if we look at the history of the United States, I think we could say it begins with a corporation. The Virginia Company.
Correct, absolutely correct. Rhode Island Company, Hudson Bay Company. And this was the way of early Elizabethan imperialism, partly because the British state was not so, or the English state at that stage, was not so very strong. There was not a vast army. There were not the resources to raise cash to, put hundreds of thousands of men into the field or raise enormous armies. So a lot of the early raiding, for example, of Portuguese and Spanish treasure ships doesn't happen from the navy. It happens from people we politely call privateers, basically pirates, like Drake and Raleigh, preying on Spanish and Portuguese shipping. And there are a whole load of companies or the slave trade initially is run out of something called the Royal Africa Company, which famously, and this is something which people bring up more and more, of which the Crown was a heavy investor. And So yes, the state is not the initial organ of British imperialism at all. The East India Company is one of a number of corporations which are chartered by private individuals with basically certificates from the Crown, which gives them permission to start these things up. And the Virginia Company, the Rhode Island Company, the Hudson Bay Company in America, the Royal Africa Company, the slaving company operating to Africa, and the East India Company with control of everything east of the Cape.
What more can
Enormously powerful companies with vast resources.
the Royal Africa Company? What more can you tell me about that?
Royal Africa Company was again a sort of contemporary of the East India Company, and it started off with trading in a variety of different things to Africa. It was selling, I think, initially arms and various baubles to African elites, but very soon got into the business of buying human beings and shipping them both to the Americas and to the Caribbean. On the way, wiping out many of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. The Caribs get wiped out, and the Middle Passage, this terrible, inhuman shipment of human beings from Africa to Caribbean slave plantations, where they are beaten and broken and made to work on the plantations. But this, of course, is very profitable, and the money gets channeled back to England. Jamaica makes far more money for the British than the whole of the Americas at the time of the Revolution. And the big worry in London is not Yorktown and Washington and the fall of America, which was certainly a humiliation. But economically, the far bigger worry was that Jamaica might go too, and a lot of the resources that Britain has to deploy are spent to guard the Caribbean.
Coming back to India, just before Great Britain nationalizes the East India Company, there's an uprising against the East
Correct.
India Company in India. Tell me about that uprising.
So this is the subject of a previous book, which I think I spoke with you before, Mitch, about a book called The Last Mughal. And this is the last of these four books that I produced on the East India Company. Anarchy, chronologically, is the first. White Moguls is the second. A Return of a King about the East India Company invading Afghanistan is the third. And the fourth and final one, bringing the story to its closure, is The Last Mughal. And it isn't just any old uprising that you're referring to. It's the largest anti-colonial uprising in colonial history. The
Still,
British call it the Indian Mutiny, and the Indians now refer it to as the First War of Independence. The truth is somewhere in between that. I use the Great Uprising as a kind of neutral term in the middle. And it's an extraordinary business. The East India Company sepoys, these Indian soldiers working for British masters who've had enough by 1857, rise up against their own officers. It's not, it's not the princes of India principally, it's not the peasants, it's not the tribals, though all those peoples play some part in it. It is the East India Company's own troops which turn their guns on their officers, then march to Delhi and try and put the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar on the throne. Tragically, the Mughal Emperor at this stage is a wonderful poet, a great commissioner of wonderful paintings, and a great artist, but he's no Che Guevara, which is what you need in this situation. And through lack of leadership, above all, these hundreds of thousands of sepoys who fail to unite under a single general and fight their own little wars are eventually starved out. And in September 1857, the East India Company gathers another army from tribal levies in the northwest frontier, along with some Sikh troops in the Punjab, and it comes down to Delhi and it massacres the population of Delhi. Every male over the age of 16 is considered fair game and shot. And no one knows the true scale of the atrocities and the violence which follow the end of this, but certainly into the hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. And this is such a mess, and also such an enormous sort of financial screw up, that the East India Company is rolled up in 1858 and replaced by the British Raj. Lord Canning goes to Allahabad Fort, which is an old Mughal fort where one of the important first treaties, the Treaty of Allahabad, which took over these territories initially from the Mughal Emperor in 1765. That's where the company's rolled up, 1858, 200 years later, 100 years later.
Is it just the British Empire now at this time, or does it transform into a particular arm of the government department?
Yeah, this is the period 1858. You really get the beginning of the British Empire proper in its sort of most familiar form. America's long gone, but this is the empire of Queen Victoria, and it's a very profitable operation for the British. The British always like to pretend that it's all for the good of the colonized, but few historians today take that view, because all the raw materials are shipped down to the coast, shipped off back to Britain, and all this finances the Industrial Revolution, which hugely enriches Britain.
Before the arrival of the East India Company into India, as you mentioned, is perhaps the wealthiest place in the world. At the end of all this, it's one of the poorest.
Exactly right. Crudely speaking, the statistics are this: that India produces around 40% of world GDP in 1650, when the company is just getting going. England at that stage has about 7%. In 1947, when the British Empire is rolled up after the Second World War, those figures are more or less reversed. India's down to single digits contribution to the world economy, and Britain is between a quarter and a half. And so it's a very straightforward argument, I think, to show that however much the British might like to regard their empire as benign, certainly better than those of the Belgian or the French, or at the end of the day, it was run for Britain, and it did greatly increase the prosperity of Britain. Gave it also enormous military resources. A lot of the soldiers who fought in the First and the Second World War were from India and the rest of the empire, and it enormously hobbled India, which is in a sense only beginning to recover now, 75 years later.
So it sounds like there is no British Empire without India. There's no British global dominance without India. This is an era of European colonial powers. Were there any other European powers that were trying to get into India?
Well, at the beginning, there'd been a great deal. The first there were the Dutch. First there were the Portuguese, who founded a sea-based empire with a base in Goa, but other bases around the Indian Ocean at places like Hormuz and a whole variety of forts across the Indian Ocean. The next up, the Dutch. The Dutch are distinguished by their incredible banking power. They basically invent the stock exchange, and they have a whole lot of very clever financial instruments that allow them to outperform the East India Company. So famously, the first reason that the company is formed is to take on the Dutch on the spice trade. Now, this is this trade in nutmeg and cinnamon and so on, which is operating out of what we today call Indonesia, but in those days were known as the East Indies.
And the Banda
And
Islands, right? There was a
all
massacre
that,
in the Banda Islands.
exactly that. And so the Dutch outperform the company very quickly at this period. The East India Company cannot keep up with the VOC, which is the much more fleet, much more well-financed, better run Dutch version. And there's a famous treaty made at the end of this period when the British basically pull out of the spice trade. And in one particular treaty, the island of Run, now part of Indonesia, a very small and forgotten area, but which at the time produced all the nutmeg in the world, is swapped for a boggy island in the Hudson River named Manhattan. And that's how Manhattan came into British hands. A good deal in the long term. But so yes, so first up the Portuguese, next up the Dutch, and then the English and the French are wrangling throughout the 18th century. The English are based out of Calcutta, the French out of Pondicherry in the south. And there's a moment when this character called Dupleix takes over the French operations when it looks like he's going to shove the British right out. This is the same period as the 7-Year War, what you call the French and Indian War, when the last Mohicans is going on up in Lake Huron, and all those sort of conflicts are taking place in the Great Lakes. And the French and the English fight it out, both in the Carnatic and Bengal, and ultimately the English company beats the French. Why? Because the English company is run by merchants and is a very ruthless capitalist organization, while the French company is run out of Versailles by the French crown, and it just isn't as efficient, isn't as ruthless, is run by a bunch of slightly effete aristocrats who can't keep up with the raw mercantile capitalism of the English East India Company. And then, having finished off the French, the English East India Company then turns its guns on the Mughal successor states. So it takes out Siraj ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal, Shuja ud-Dawla, who's the Nawab of central, what's now UP, Awadh, and then they take on Tipu Sultan, the Marathas. And there's an awful lot of military history in this book. There's some terrific full-scale battles. Sometimes Tipu Sultan is the first Indian leader to basically use European weapons effectively against the Europeans, and better, has better rifles, has better guns. He outperforms the British with cavalry maneuvers and so on. And for a while, it looks as if Tipu might take on the company, but by this stage, it's too late because he just doesn't have the resources that the company has. The company has now such deep pockets because it sees Bengal, which is the money bags of Mughal India, 1 million looms churning out cloth that can be taxed every year. So Tipu fights very bravely and very efficiently and very effectively, but he just hasn't got the financial resources you need to take on the company by this stage. And then there's a final conflict with a group of people called the Marathas, very famous in India today, regarded as the archetypal Indian nationalists and Hindu nationalists. These are peasant cavalrymen fighting from the uplands of Maharashtra above Bombay. And they do a lot of the dismantling of the Mughal Empire. And they are also extremely fierce fighters. And the Duke of Wellington, who as a young man, Arthur Wellesley, is sent off to fight Marathas. And when he loses 3/4 of his troops in 2 engagements against the Marathas, he, at the end of his career, says it was a much tougher fight than it was against Napoleon. Waterloo is nothing compared to these battles. But it is a very close-run contest. But in the end, the company seizes it. Operating out of one building in the city of London, Leadenhall Street, under what's now the Lloyd's building, the famous Richard Rogers structure from the 1980s. Underneath that, in the vaults, are the groaning chambers of the East India Company, still there.
William Dalrymple, you live in India. Getting back to this dynamic of India being the wealthiest place in the world before the East India Company, and then after the British leave in 1948, one of the poorest places in the world. Were there reparations with independence, and Do people still talk about reparations in India today?
So at the time, nothing. No, absolutely not. And the British very successfully spin a narrative that the British came to India that was broken and disunited and fractured, and formed a single nation, and gave it civilization and railways. Today, post-colonial scholars scoff rightly at what is effectively British propaganda, and point out that India, while it was certainly in a period of civil war, was enormously civilized, enormously rich. I mean, throughout most of history, world manufacturing has been dominated by one of two countries. It's either China or it's India. In the early Middle Ages, it's mainly China. By the 18th century, it's mainly India. And we're now returning to a world where that is again becoming a fact. We're seeing every day the power of China growing, both technological and economic. And India is way behind China still. But I think in our lifetimes, we will see the rise of the rupee and the rise of Indian power.
That's interesting. You
Yeah.
have a line in your book that you reminded me of. It says this, quote, almost single-handedly, it, meaning East India Company, reversed the balance trade, which from Roman times on had led to a continual drain of Western bullion eastwards. So usually wealth, historically speaking, wealth flowed in the opposite direction until the East India Company that seemed to reverse that flow. But now you're saying, looks like it's reversing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm funny enough. The book I'm writing now, I finished the East India Company 3 years ago, and it's only just now coming out in paperback. But the book I'm writing now is the story of the early period, and I've been reading a lot of letters, for example, by Pliny, writing in the years before Pompey, in the 70s AD, about sort of 40 years after Christ was crucified, and he's writing about he's very angry about the amount of Roman gold which is being lost to India because of the exotic tastes of immoral Roman women who want to be seen in diaphanous silks and saris, who want to rub their bodies with unguents and sandalwood coming from India, and who want to hang Indian jewels around their neck and around their arms. And Pliny is not just sounding off in a sort of madcap, sort of retrograde way. We've seen the evidence. Archaeologists digging now in Roman Egypt have found a variety of papyri that give the figures for this. And in Vienna, there's a papyrus that was found in Roman Egypt that has just been translated. And it tells how one shipment from India was enough to buy you, the largest belt of farmland in Roman Egypt. And the tax from the India trade paid for 1/3 of the entire Roman army. So the customs duty coming in from the trade with India was enough to pay for 1/3 of the entire Roman army, stretching from Hadrian's Wall to southern Egypt and Algeria. So that gives you a picture of the wealth that's being generated by India at this period. And this is the reason the company goes to India, because it's a very rich place. Today, we tend to think of India as a rather poor place. We think of it, beggars and poverty. But that is, in many ways, the legacy of colonialism, and something which is beginning to end in our own day.
William Dalrymple has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation on the history of the East India Company. He is the author of the book called The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. William Dalrymple, I found that a very fascinating conversation, and I thank you for taking this time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Mitch. It's always a pleasure.